Let's go ahead and get started. So I, first want to go over, the overall message of this series. And it's really meant to just be an introduction for people who maybe haven't ever done any management on their own lake, or whether you're a homeowner or a municipal leader, or even if you're just interested in the topic. You don't necessarily have to be a lake manager, but this is just meant to be an introductory series. So it won't be exhaustive. So let me go ahead and introduce myself. I am Lindsay Yoder. I'm the Aquatic Programs Coordinator for Teatown Lake Reservation. And I'm also the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Coordinator for the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. And in my capacity as the AIS Program Coordinator for the Lower Hudson PRISM, I do primarily focus on aquatic invasive plants. So that's my forte. And that's why I say this is really just an introductory series, because I do focus more on plants. But when we're talking about lake management, I think it's really important that we consider not only what's going on inside the lake, but what is going on outside of the lake. And so that's really what this whole series is about. So when we're thinking about lake management, we need to think about the big picture. The whole goal of this series is to really help you to utilize a holistic and integrated lake management approach. So that means when we talk about an integrated approach, that means we can't just think about the algae problem or the plant problem that's inside the lake, but we have to think about what's going on around it as well. And that's what's going to ultimately help you create a more healthy or self-sustaining lake. And while, it's a lofty goal to ever think that your lake is going to be completely self-sufficient and not require any management from you, that should be the ultimate goal, is to not have to add excess nutrients or, add infrastructure. You want the lake to be able to sustain itself. So while that may never happen, that should be what your goal is in mind when you're thinking about a management plan. And so the layout of the series is really encouraged to utilize that integrated approach, because we can't just treat the symptoms of what's going on inside the lake. You have to treat the cause. So the first part of that is really considering your lake, your individual lake. Every single lake is going to be different, from the depth to the topography. So there are some major components that you have to consider before doing any sort of management. And that includes the size of your watershed, the amount of pollution or nutrient availability, the slope and topography and how that influences erosion, any land use that might be happening around the lake, as well as the inlet community and structure. And that includes, your plant community as well as your fishery. So to give you a little bit of an example of what I'm talking about when we need to consider, the watershed and what's going on inside the lake, I'm going to use Teatown Lake as an example. So Teatown has a very large land size to lake ratio of 19:1. That means there's a lot of land draining into one very small 40-acre lake. And the natural land to lake ratio is about 10:1. So Teatown has 756 acres of land, 81% of which is forested, 11% is residential, and 4% is wetlands. And that residential and wetland component is extremely important, not only when we're talking about the development around the watershed that's going to influence what's happening inside the lake, but the wetlands act as very important pollutant buffers as well as soil stabilizers. So the watershed characteristics of the around Teatown Lake directly influence the entire quality of the lake, and historical land use in particular is a major influencer of what's going on inside Teatown Lake. So historically, we had a lot of agriculture and deforestation and logging, which contributed to a pretty large amount of erosion and high levels of nutrient loading. So when we talk about nutrient loading, there's in-lake nutrients and outside of the lake nutrients, and we'll get more in detail about that. But if you see, as you see here, the historical land use at Teatown caused about 88% of our phosphorus load in the lake to actually come from outside. It's coming from runoff from erosion and septic systems. And what is that? What's the water quality like? Well, we have very low turbidity. It's very clear, which seems like a good thing, and it is for the most part, except it does contribute to some of the other problems we have. We do have a basic pH or a neutral pH, but that low turbidity really helps our lake be eutrophic, which means it's highly productive. There's a lot of sunlight that's getting all the way to the bottom. It's a very shallow lake, only about 4 feet on average. So it's highly productive. It's got a lot of different species of plankton, including phytoplankton and zooplankton. And that high productivity is contributing to an extreme variation in dissolved oxygen levels. We have very low oxygen at the bottom of the lake, but very saturated at the top. And that's mostly due to excess plant growth. So a little bit more about eutrophication and what it is. It does not mean that the lake is unhealthy, which is a common misconception. Eutrophic is a very natural process. It simply results in that nutrient-rich, highly productive system, as I mentioned, but it's inevitable. Every single lake is going to become eutrophic at some point. It just usually occurs on a more geologic timescale from hundreds to thousands of years, as opposed to the very short amount of time that it's taken for Teatown Lake to become eutrophic. And that's primarily due to another concept, which is cultural eutrophication. Now, this is very typical of the shallow man-made lakes that we'll find in our region. Human disruption typically accelerates this process of eutrophication. Including stormwater runoff, which is primarily due to, covering natural land with pavement. And that stormwater runoff includes fertilizers and pesticides, as well as just erosion of the land and input of excess sediments and nutrients. And for the case at Teatown, as I mentioned, that early land use of agriculture and logging, and then the present day septic system leaching. That's what's really contributing to our eutrophication. And what does it do? Well, it causes that excess plant and algae growth, which then contributes to an overall reduction in water quality and the oxygen fluctuation. All right, so let's go ahead and get started talking about algae. I wanted to really start off with showing algae some love. I think it's a perfect starting point for trying to propel this integrated approach narrative because algae typically has a very bad attitude towards it. I'm sure when you think of algae, you don't think positive things. You think these types of things. It's growth, it's pond scum, it's muck. But as many examples in this series will show, algae is just a symptom. It's not the problem. It's the human activity that is causing the problem that needs to be addressed. So it is Earth Day, and I wanted to give the Earth a shout out by showing you this picture, which is very obvious that we have a lot more water than we do land. And we typically think of trees as providing us all of this oxygen that we need to survive. And of course, trees are a vital component of our ecosystems and we need them. But water contains a lot of algae. And algae photosynthesize and produce a lot of oxygen, a lot more than the trees do. About 70 to 80% of all of the available oxygen on Earth actually comes from algae. So we have a lot to thank algae for. And in order to sort of change this attitude about algae and sort of put a more positive spin on it. Let's go back a little bit. We'll go back about 16 billion years ago. This is when cyanobacteria, which is not actually an algae, but a bacteria, first came on the scene. This is a unicellular organism that was kind of hanging out by itself there for about 1 billion years. And that billion years of photosynthesis put a lot of oxygen into the atmosphere, so much so that new life was able to evolve, including new algal species, one of which was green algae. And green algae found its way onto land about 475 million years ago or so, and really started to evolve into all of the terrestrial plants that we know and love today, which in turn, of course, influences the entire food chain from animals all the way up to us. So what are they? Well, they are very simple eukaryotic organisms. That means they have a nucleus. They are undifferentiated. What that means is they don't have a lot of different parts like other plants. So a tree has leaves and stem and roots and all of that. Algae don't have any of that. Algae have just one cell or a few cells all clumped together. They contain chlorophyll A. That's the pigment that allows them to actually photosynthesize. It obviously, we know it as being kind of green, but it can be in other colors. And why we should love them? Well, they're photoautotrophs. They don't need any help from us to, create their own food from sunlight. They're primary producers, so they form the base of the food chain. And they can really live anywhere. I say they're masters of the aquaverse because anywhere where there is a little bit of moisture, they can survive. This picture of a polar bear here, the algae is not actually on top of the polar bear. Polar bears have hollow fur, and algae is able to grow inside their individual hairs, which is pretty incredible. But they can also grow on top of rocks, as shown in the picture before. They grow on turtle backs. I have a wooden staircase that algae really loves to grow on once it gets wet. So it's pretty incredible. They can live anywhere. So now I want to go over a few different categories and of algae. So we've got big algae. These are your seaweeds and more filamentous algae. So obviously we have red algae. Now this is primarily marine. Nearly 90% of red algae are going to be found in marine ecosystems. So we're not going to focus on it too much. But this is one that is more plant-like. They're masses of cells as opposed to just one single cell. Then we have brown algae. Again, this is another species that is majority marine. There are some freshwater species, but not very many. This one's probably common to a lot of you. I mean, this is a giant kelp. And then we have green algae. These are the most common here. We have 90% of green algae are freshwater species. Also kind of considered plants, but again, they're not plants, they're just masses of cells. And there are about 7,000 species of green algae. Then we have microscopic. We've got phytoplankton. This is what really forms that base of the food chain that is eaten by zooplankton and other fish. We have diatoms. And then we have dinoflagellates. So dinoflagellates are what are responsible in marine ecosystems for bioluminescence, which is pretty amazing. But they're also responsible for the red tides, those red harmful algal blooms that you will often see off the coast in many places. So in New York, since this is where we're based, this is where we're going to focus. We do have diatoms. These are silica-based. If you were to pick them up, they kind of feel a little bit like fiberglass almost. These are rarely a nuisance, although we do have one that people would probably consider a nuisance, and that's didymo or rock snot. There's still some debate about this, whether or not it's native or invasive, but we do have this here in New York. But they rarely become a problem just because they are replaced by green algae. So green algae, we have two major groups, chlorophyta and charophyta, and they include many different types, including the ones shown before. We have unicellular phytoplankton all the way up to multicellular more filamentous macroalgae. We've got phytoplankton, periphyton, and epiphytes. These are the ones that are going to stick to rocks or grow on top of plants. And then we also have the filamentous macroalgae. These are going to be the ones that look more like plants and what really become more of a nuisance. And a really common one here in this region, this is Cara or musk grass. If you crunch this one, it doesn't smell too great. I'm sure a lot of you, if you have lakes on your property, you're probably familiar with this one. All right, so I've been showing algae some love. I think I've given it its due, but there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, obviously. And so when we talk about algae becoming a nuisance, one major concept that is important for you to know is something known as the limiting factor. What that means essentially is when an element, either light or nutrients, is in short supply, it limits the ability of any other of plants to use any other element. For example, if there is abundant light but very little phosphorus, photosynthesis will not occur, even if there's plenty of light available. But if phosphorus suddenly becomes abundant, then there will be an influx of photosynthesis, and that's what's going to lead to those blooms that start to become a problem. And the limiting factor for algae in freshwater systems is usually phosphate or phosphorus. In marine systems, it's typically nitrate or nitrogen. But since we're dealing with freshwater systems here, usually phosphorus is going to be your biggest problem when it comes to algae becoming a nuisance. And that happens, of course, as we mentioned earlier, through human activity and nutrient loading. So in the lower Hudson region, we'll go over, again, these different types of cultural or causes of cultural eutrophication. We've got home septic systems, fertilizers, erosion and bottom sediment, animals, logging and deforestation, and lakeshore development and stormwater. And how it happens, obviously, it's the consequence of photosynthesis. All of a sudden, you've got a huge amount of phosphorus coming into the lake, either through in-lake nutrient loading or from external sources. Either way, you have a sudden influx of phosphorus. And then that algae, it just starts photosynthesizing. It's been waiting, and now it's got its limiting factor, and it can start blooming. So to summarize, we've got an increase in nutrients, primarily phosphorus, and that's going to then lead to an increase in algal blooms. And then once those blooms start to die off, they have to be decomposed by bacteria. And here's where the problem really starts to occur. That decomposition by bacteria, while the bacteria are consuming the algae and breaking it down, they're also consuming oxygen. So when you have a very large bloom that's dying off all at once, and all the bacteria are consuming that algae, you're going to get a very low level of dissolved oxygen. And then I have this arrow here going from decrease in O2 all the way back to the increase in nutrients. Now, what's happening here? What's happening in this cycle from the decrease in O2 to the increase in nutrients? This is where your in-lake nutrient loading comes in. So we're not talking about, we've talked about runoff, we've talked about erosion. We're not talking about that. This is the stuff that's coming from inside the lake. Now, what happens when there's a decrease in oxygen is all of a sudden, lake processes and life need to go on. It can't just stop because there's oxygen all of a sudden. So there are a lot of, microorganisms and other things that have to happen in the lake that still need energy. And so what happens is the bottom sediments are going to start to release other nutrients through a series of chemical reactions in order to try and feed those processes. And, we go from iron to manganese to nitrogen and phosphorus. So this is where all of these nutrients start to be loaded from inside the lake. And then, of course, the process starts all over again. And this is why it's very important, and why the whole goal of this is to talk about completely integrated management, is because you can address what's going on outside, you can address what's going on inside. But if you don't address both, then the problem will still continue. If you don't take care of what's going on inside the lake, you might still have this internal loading of nutrients. And if you don't take care of what's going outside, you'll have that external loading of nutrients. So this is an important consideration when you're talking about management. And what happens when it becomes a nuisance? I'm sure many of you know, if you've ever been around an algal bloom, obviously there is a depletion of water quality, which leads to fish kills, very foul odor, and can be problematic for drinking water. It's a nuisance for aesthetic reasons. It's not very attractive when it starts showing up on all of your boat docks and rocks, but it's also dangerous. You could slip and fall on that. And then we also have harmful algal bloom. So I want to go into harmful algal blooms a little bit. It's not actually algae. So harmful algal blooms are actually that cyanobacteria that I was talking about in the beginning of the presentation. It gets that name just because it's a similar color. So a lot of people think it's algae, but it's not. We do have 3 very common species of cyanobacteria in New York, and their nicknames are Annie, Fanny, and Mike. You can practice saying their scientific names out loud to yourself if you want. So these species are living in the water at all times, and they're not a problem normally. It's just when you have that influx of nutrients and that creates a toxic bloom that occurs all at once. And the toxins are actually not present once you see them, when they're able to be seen. When you have that mat of green algae or your entire lake that has turned green, that's not necessarily when the algae or the cyanobacteria is a problem. But once they start to die off and decompose and their cell walls are burst, the toxins are then released into the water. So here's a couple of images of how you could try and recognize a harmful algal bloom. The main thing is they are not filamentous. So you cannot pick them up. If you can pick it up and hold it in your hand and it's actually, has some body to it, that's most likely not a harmful algal bloom. It's just regular algae. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't also maybe a harmful bloom happening at the same time as you're having a filamentous bloom, but that's just one tip. So it mostly looks kind of like paint in the water. It can be like splotchy or streaky. If you put like a kayak or canoe paddle into the lake and pull it out and it looks like you've just coated it in paint, that's a pretty good sign that you've got a harmful algal bloom. Also, if you just have the entire water column is a faint green color and you can see little individual particles floating in the water column, that could also be an indicator. HABs are not my specialty, so I do have a link down here, which I am happy to send out because it's kind of a strange link. This is how you actually report HABs in New York. So if you want to write that down, that might be helpful to you. Again, I can also send it out to the registrant list. But these obviously have some health threats to people and animals. It's going to depend on the species you have, and it's very hard to know what species you have unless you get it actually analyzed. But it can cause anything from respiratory distress to acute liver toxicity. All right, so we're going to get into some management options. But before we do that, I do want to go over a little bit about lake classification or lake profiles. So lake stratification, that's what we see here in this image. And this is not going to happen in every lake. And in fact, a lot of lakes in our region are not stratified because we do have a lot of shallow lakes. And stratification occurs primarily just in lakes that are over 10 to 12 feet deep. And that's because shallow lakes can be easily mixed by wind. And stratification is occurring because there are layers in the lake that cannot be mixed. And that's simply because different temperatures create different densities of water, and those different densities are separated. And we'll go through, why that is. So the epilimnion, this is your top layer. This is going to be the warmest and least dense layer. It's also obviously the most oxygen-rich layer. You then have the metalimnion, which is a smaller layer. It's not really depicted well in this image because it's not usually at the same size as the other layers. This is what contains the thermocline. And what the thermocline is the portion of the lake that has the most rapid change between temperature and density with depth. And this creates kind of a barrier that keeps that top warm oxygen-rich layer from mixing with that bottom cold hypolimnion layer. And the hypolimnion, that's the coldest and most dense water, and it also has the lowest dissolved oxygen. So it's really important that you know your own lake and whether or not you have such stratification, because that's really going to influence what kind of management you can do, as we'll see on the next few slides. So first I'm going to go over the physical management. This is, actual infrastructure. So artificial circulation or aerators, this is probably the most common physical management. You've probably heard of this, or maybe you even have this on your lake already. It's when air is actually injected into the hypolimnion. So we're taking oxygen from the atmosphere and we're injecting it into that cold oxygen poor hypolimnion layer. And that change in oxygen and also that change in temperature, because you're bringing in warm air into the lower layer, that's going to allow for the lake to then mix, which obviously is going to help to change that low O2 condition and reduce nutrient release. So as I mentioned before, you have very low oxygen. That's whenever those nutrients start to release from that bottom layer. So artificial circulation tries to prevent that from happening by causing the lake to mix. This is hopefully obviously limited to stratified lakes, and that's because if you don't have a hypolimnion or you don't have stratification, you don't really need artificial circulation because your lake is able to mix by itself. Now, in some cases, including at Teatown Lake, you might have a not well mixed lake. In Teatown, we have very anoxic conditions on the bottom and very high oxygen on the top. But that is because we have excess plant growth. So if we were to put in an aerator, it wouldn't really solve our problem because we still have a lot of excess plants that we would need to take care of. So it's not that we don't have circulation, it's that we have too many plants. This also creates an even temperature. So it's important that you know your ecosystem structure and your fishery, because if you have, a cold water fishery, or you have both, you have a warm water fishery in the upper layers and cold water in the lower layers, creating that even temperature is not going to be good for your cold water species. So hypolimnion aeration, this is obviously another type of aeration, but this does not do the same as artificial circulation. What this does is increases the oxygen in the hypolimnion, similarly to the other, but it does it by actually pulling up deep water and exposing it to the air and then bringing it back to the lake bottom. So this is good because it doesn't actually mix the lake. You're just bringing up cold water, exposing it to oxygen, and bringing it back down. So this is going to help maintain stratification, which is obviously good for the fishery if you have a cold water fishery. The lake needs to be really deep for this, and it has to have a very large hypolimnion. And you have to be careful of nitrogen saturation, because if you pull in too much from the atmosphere, the nitrogen from the atmosphere cannot be broken down in the water. So then you could have an excess of atmospheric nitrogen, which could be dangerous for your fish. So hypolimnetic withdrawal, This is a more passive system, so it doesn't really require much work except for the setup. It's very inexpensive to maintain, but very expensive to start because there is a lot of infrastructure that goes into it. So what this does is you basically have two pipes. You have one that siphons out the deep and oxygen poor water and deposits it into a receiving stream using gravity. And then you have another pipe that's obviously bringing fresh water into the lake. Again, this is limited to stratified lakes, and the water output needs to be equal to the water being input. Another one that's good for a cold water fishery because it doesn't cause that mixing. And this one, again, this is good when external nutrient loading has been addressed. And that's because the whole point of this is to prevent internal nutrient loading. But if you still have a lot of excess nutrients coming in from the outside, you're not really doing much. All right, so some of the chemical management options. Algicides are the most common and the cheapest option. And especially in our region, it's very popular. Copper sulfate is the most common chemical. And it's great because it kills algal cells and it's very fast acting, but it is a short-term solution. And I have to emphasize this. It doesn't address any of the other concerns. It's not going to address your nutrient problems, either in lake or out of the lake. So if you have a bloom that you absolutely need to get rid of right away, yes, algicides will do that, but it is a very short-term solution. And once that algae dies off, and the algicide wears off, the algae can just come back. It's not going to get rid of them for long. The good thing, of course, is that it can be used in a wide variety of lakes. It doesn't matter if your lake is stratified or not, but there are non-target organisms that are very easily affected, from fish to amphibians to zooplankton. And speaking of zooplankton being affected, algae or phytoplankton rebound a lot faster than zooplankton, which causes major disruption in the food chain. So even if your fish are not affected, if your zooplankton are affected, then the fish that consume zooplankton are going to be put out by the fact that there are no zooplankton available for them to eat. And then the algae are going to be able to rebound. So this is going to give you an uneven distribution in your fishery, where you might have had, a nice balance between large, more planktivorous fish and smaller herbivorous fish. If you deplete the zooplankton, then you're going to all of a sudden have a lot of the herbivorous fish that can feed on phytoplankton, but you're going to lose your other fish. Nutrient precipitation and inactivation. So this is using alum, and this removes phosphorus from the water column, and that deactivation will help to keep sediments from releasing excess nutrients. This is fast acting, and it's not actually just cosmetic. This is a potential long-term solution. Again, this is good when external nutrient loads have been addressed, because this is good for addressing internal nutrient loading. But again, if you have not addressed the outside, it doesn't really matter what you do on the inside. It's more cost effective, and it's long lasting for lakes with an in-lake sediment issue. So if that is the reason why you have a lot of in-lake nutrient loading, is because you have a lot of sediment. Dredging is another common technique that people use or want to use, but it's very expensive. I mean, it can be millions of dollars, and it's an extensive permitting process here in New York. So this is just a lot better of an option for most people. There's also less of a stigma, because as opposed to algicide, which is a chemical that's designed to kill algae, alum is used a lot in drinking water treatment at wastewater treatment plants for pollutants. And again, aluminum toxicity is something you have to know your fishery and know your lake. Biological, there's only one real option for this, and that's biomanipulation and fish stocking. This is just trying to change the lake ecosystem dynamics and maybe what you might think is a more natural way. Now, there are invasive fish that people stock, but I'm not going to talk about that. But this would be a more natural way that you could try and solve your algae problem. So this can be either through stocking or removing certain species. So if you're stocking fish to reduce algae, what you would do is stock fish that outcompete fish that eat zooplankton. And that's because zooplankton eat phytoplankton. So if you have a fish that's outcompeting that planktivorous fish, then there will be more zooplankton available to consume more of the phytoplankton, which should hopefully reduce algae. So this is a top-down food web management option. There's also fish removal. So removing those bottom feeders that are going to disrupt the sediment and, you know, quote unquote, unlock the nutrients from the sediment. Obviously, this does have a potential for long term. I mean, you do have to continuously restock, but it's not predictable. I mean, you know, we could try to stock fish that would hopefully outcompete the, you know, planktivorous fish, but it's not a guarantee that that's going to work. So, overview, what did we learn? Algae is amazing, and we have to thank it for human progress, but there can be too much of a good thing. So we must treat the causes and not just the symptoms. And that includes using integrated watershed management approach. Now I am going to open it up to questions. If you have a question, you could just type it in the chat box. That's going to be the best way. And then I'll answer it here on the video. If you think of something later or I don't get to your question, feel free to email me. And if I don't know the answer to your question, I'm obviously happy to do research and send that back to you. So I'm just going to pause here and let me know if you have questions. Okay. Question from Sarah: how do you find out if your lake is stratified? So this is something that you would need to have someone come and do for you. You'll have to have someone conduct a complete lake profile for your lake and take temperature at different depths and create a lake profile for you. Julie asked or said that why do we keep referring to harmful algal blooms as algae? Do algae treat cyanobacteria? I do think that algicides are able to treat harmful algal blooms. I think. Again, I'm not an expert in the HABs situation, but they are cyanobacteria. They are not algae. I think they're primarily referred to as algae just because it's easy. It's much easier to say algae than cyanobacteria when you're just trying to get a message to the general public, especially when you're talking about really large lakes that are commonly used by a lot of people. What methods are available to control runoff and phosphorus loading? So that's the runoff and phosphorus loading. A big part of that is going to be creating a vegetative buffer, which we are going to have another session discussing that. Planting a vegetative buffer, and that's going to help to take up some of that excess phosphorus. Creating a stable stream bank or shoreline, that's a big part of it. Also, from like septic leaching is a big one. I believe there is a document that I could share that talks about septic leaching and how to prevent that. Mostly it's through maintenance. A lot of people don't maintain their septic systems as often as you really need to. A really big source of a lot of excess phosphorus in lakes. Robert, copper versus alum data. That's a great question, and I will be happy to look into that for you and send that along to the group. Not all cyanobacteria are harmful. That's right. Not all of them are. And it's really hard to know exactly what kind of cyanobacteria you have and if it does have toxins unless you get it analyzed, which is why a lot of places just kind of take extra precautions. Anytime something looks kind of suspicious, they put the sign up, especially if it's a public place, obviously. How do you know how much alum to add to the water? Is it based on the volume of the lake water? It probably is. I'm not a certified lake manager. So that would be something you'd have to reach out to a lake management company. If anyone wants recommendations of lake management companies, I'd be happy to send those along as well. I do have a few that we work with, but I don't believe that you can actually do an alum treatment if you're not certified. I'm not positive on that, but usually for these types of things, you do have to have someone who is certified by the DEC to do that kind of work. Fiona asked, can you talk about conditions that created toxic algae that killed dogs last summer? I'm not sure of the specific conditions, but that's a harmful algal bloom. So that is primarily due to excess nutrients. And then obviously as it gets warmer, there's more solar radiation. So there's more photosynthesis. Julie kind of answered that other question that someone asked. Alum's still not legal in New York State, excepting a couple of test lakes. True. So this management option is listed as an option in Diet for a Small Lake, but that might be what you're referring to. So I'm not positive on that. I thought it was people. Andrew asked, are you aware of any evidence that chemical controls for pond and lake algae result in the loss of beneficial algae and the consequences? Algicides kill all of the algae. So that obviously has a pretty big impact toward the entire food chain. Most algae is beneficial. Most people are treating algal blooms because they're undesirable based on, aesthetics or, if it's causing a foul odor but most algae is beneficial. So yes, it is killing beneficial algae. Lynn said, I've been told that treating HABs with algicide actually makes the toxins worse by releasing them when the algal cells break. Is this correct? Is there any way to address the toxins themselves? Yeah, that's great, Lynn, exactly. If you treat HABs with algicide, you're killing it, which, is going to release the toxins. As I said, they die when you, they're released when they die back. So is there any way to address the toxins themselves? I don't believe we know that yet. HABs are like a really big area in research right now because of this, because we don't really have a way to treat it. Do you have any info on barley straw or know where I can retrieve? So barley straw is another management technique that's mentioned in Diet for a Small Lake, which is written for New York State. But it's just very uncommon. I think it's one of those management techniques that just isn't widely used because they're not sure necessarily how it works. So I don't have any specific info on it, but I can ask around some of my lake management colleagues and see if they have used it or if they have any sort of info on where you can get it. John asked, when aerating a pond, are you better off pulling water from the bottom or the top? So you're pulling water from the bottom. That's because you're pulling that lower oxygen poor water from the bottom and bringing it to the top. If you were, but it's circular, so it's not really necessarily either or. Again, I'm not a structural expert on how aerators work, but so Joan asked if a lake is less than 12 feet deep, does aeration make sense? No, it really doesn't. When a lake is really shallow, it's automatically, aerated by natural wind mixing. And if your lake is shallow and you still have an issue with pseudo stratification, like maybe you have really low oxygen at the bottom and high oxygen at the top, it's probably indicative of something else. It's not really about the mixing. So at Teatown, we have really excess plant growth, and that's what keeps our lake, kind of stratified. So if you added an aerator in that situation, it's not really going to help you. It'll start mixing the lake, but your lake was already, being mixed, most likely. That doesn't mean that there's not, the possibility of a lake being stratified that's less than 12 feet deep. But again, that's something that you would have to have a company come out and do that profile. Is this presentation suitable for sizes of lakes, including smaller bodies and ponds? Yeah, as long as you're not, there's not really a clear distinction on what a pond is and what a lake is. There's no set number. So when you're considering management, the biggest thing is stratification. So, I mean, if you've got a really deep pond, whether it's only, you know, an acre or, you know, 10 acres, if it's stratified, then you could use some of those same management techniques or not. I mean, algaecides can be used for lakes that are not stratified if you were going to do that. But yeah, it's definitely suitable for ponds too. If a lake owner gets a DEC permit to use an herbicide, does that take authority to regulate from a local municipality? I don't think it does. I don't think that getting a DEC, I don't think getting a DEC permit would trump what a municipality says for sure. So Andrew says no, and if he seems very sure of it, so I'm gonna relegate to him. All right, everyone, I think that's going to be it for this webinar. So thank you all so much for joining me, and I hope that this was helpful. And if you have any questions or think of anything later, feel free to email me. All right, thank you so much.